All right. Hello, everyone. You are listening to the Blockchain Socials podcast. I'm Josh, and I'm here with my co host Primavera. We are back for Overthrowing the Network State. And for this interview, we are speaking to Matan Field. He was a theoretical physicist back in the day, but he is now known for having been a co-founder of Lazuz, which was a ride-hailing application that was built on Bitcoin, Backfeed, and DAO Stack, which he co-founded with Primavera, and now, most recently, a project called Common. Matan is known for having been very early with a lot of the many ideas that have been sort of explored in the crypto world. And he was also with us at Zuzalu, where we sort of built out the conceptual framework for coordinations, which we've used to bring as an alternative to the network state from Balaji. But yeah, so Matan, would you like to say hello and give an introduction to yourself? And I'm wondering, I think it would be interesting to maybe recount the story of DAO Stack as well, because I think that's kind of sometimes lost in the crypto history.
Okay, hey, so thanks for having me here. Yeah, so as I said, I've practiced theoretical physics for quite a while, and in 2013 I was doing my postdoctoral research, and during that time I had an idea to do a ride-hailing app, just as a hobby, as for fun, and through that project, quite from the first week, discovered the blockchain. And back then it was Bitcoin blockchain. And and at the same time, Vitalik came with the idea for smart contracts and Ethereum. And I got really excited about that. And a few months later, I decided to quit the academy and focus on this area. And firstly with Lazuz, the decentralized ride sharing project, but quite soon after, I really got fascinated with the notion of DAOs, which was back then just a kind of like vague idea. And together with Primavera, we founded Backfeed to build technology or platform for DAOs. Um, and around 2016, you were asking about DAO Stack. So around 2016, we both kind of like ran out of funding, and roughly at the same time, DDAO, that some people may remember, came out, burst out. In the beginning, it had a lot of problems or issues which were acknowledged around like protocol issues around like game theoretic, I would say like wrong incentives, and then we started to still this was still in backfield. We started to work on proposing a new governance system for the DAO, and what quite right after what happened was the big bug and the hack, and and then the whole space was kind of like I would say in a post trauma. From if you just said a DAO, nobody was wanting to hear about the DAO, and at the same time we ran out of funding, and it seemed almost impossible to raise any funding for a DAO initiative at that time. And yeah, so that's, and then the second half of 2016 for me, I was already then I was 3 years into this journey, and all in interested and passionate about DAOs, and it was clear that I would continue the journey. So like for about 6 months, I was trying to take lessons from Backfeed, and and trying to understand what would be the next building block or next thing to start from. I mean, maybe to say in Backfeed, we've tried maybe 5 different products to develop, and all of which, I mean, still the technology, the blockchain, the smart contract technology was still very, very early. So then, looking at all of the insights taken from that journey, um, after like 6 months, I've started again, and that was DAO Stack. That was started with a few co-founders, and yeah, so that was early 17, January 17. We started. Back then, there was this was kind of like the peak of the hype of the ICO hype, and I really felt bad about it in some sense, and I had, I don't know, I had dual dual attitude towards it, because I wanted to raise funding and develop technology, but then I felt bad to raise funding by a white paper alone. So we decided that we will only start raise funding after completing a pilot of the technology. So for like about a year, we worked to build technology, the baseline technology, and we started from already then. Probably we'll get back to that, but already then we realized that we were interested to focus on large scale coordination. So how do we scale 1 million people, let's say? And we realized that this landscape of DAOs is so big, so vast, that you, each DAO will need different governance system, and also within a single DAO, you'll have many different cells likely needing different governance system, and also appreciating or acknowledging the fact that we are so early that we have no idea of what governance system will actually work. So what we decided to build was to build a framework for governance system. So like a smart like smart contracts for any code. So here, a high level framework on top of the smart contracts of Ethereum. So a high level framework for different governance system, basically for any governance system. So it was really like a language for how to build governance systems. Um, and on top of that language, on top of that framework, we've built a first interface that shows how to utilize that framework. Um, and we've built that technology, and around at the middle of 2018 we both made our own token sale, and raised a bunch of funding, and also launched at the same time. We launched the first version of this app. It was called Alchemy, with the first DAO experiment back then. I think it was the first on-chain, like significant DAO experiment. Was mid 2018. We called it the Genesis DAO, and it was practiced. I mean, today it would sound like funny. We were practicing this DAO with, or playing around with this DAO with a funding of $50,000 a month. So over a course of 18 months, I think it was between $500,000 to $1 million funding. In today's scale, it's like minuscule, and back then it was like huge. It was, people thought that we were crazy to play with so large funding with this early technology. So that was like the first part of DAO Stack. And then during the last few years, we made some shift more. I mean, again, learning more insights from this first wave, um, and then we turned a bit more to the social impact direction, and also I would say also developed, or started from other angles to deal with large scale coordination. I'm now just running through it, and probably we can go back to it. But basically, we both touched upon large scale decision making protocols that we call the holographic consensus, and nowadays we are focusing on a common app, which is focusing about the way that a large scale organization is looking more like an organism. So it's not really a single body that agrees about everything all together. It's not a single governance system, but it's more like an organism that can be made of organs, which themselves can be made of sub-organs, which themselves can be made of sub-organs and eventually cells. So this whole network structure or fractal structure is something that we are now manifesting in the common app. So this is a short, I guess, fast forward of.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about common more definitely in a bit. But I'm curious, Primavera, how do you feel having your fellow co-founder from DAO Stack on?
um, Very happy. Yeah, I think that with Matan, I think the reason that we started working together is because even though we didn't have yet the terminology, we've been but obsessed by figuring out this question of um, how do you help people coordinate themselves without having to rely on central authorities, right? And I think that's what brought us to the blockchain to begin with, right? So so yeah, I think like it's interesting because now that we can have a retrospective, and now that we are developing those new, I guess, theories or concepts around network state and network sovereignties, um, the path that we've taken actually start making a lot of sense. And yeah, I don't know if it was like it. I think it was about like being too early, and trying to provide DAO tooling at that time in which DAOs didn't mean anything to anyone. But also, I think the world not only was not understanding DAOs, but I think the world was also not as ready as it is today to understanding the possibilities of new network sovereignties. And it seems that now the ground is actually very fertile for both of those. And in fact, now there is demand for those technical tools because there is demand for those new governance structures that that DAOs can be an answer to. Um, so yeah, I think now we can start the work finally.
Yeah, I think one of the things that for me the network state is kind of like a sign or a symptom of now, I guess, a larger mass of people being more interested in these types of things and questions. That you guys were just like much earlier and much before, for example, Balaji was thinking about this. But yeah, so maybe I don't know. Next, would you like to talk a bit about um, because I think the question that I think, like you said, that attracts a lot of people to blockchains is how do we scale coordination of more and more people? How do we scale millions of people to be able to coordinate with one another to achieve, shared collective goals? Um, where do you even start, like with that question? 'Cause it seems like it's a massive one.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question that we often skip. I mean, I personally believe that that's the most important task right now, mission to be done, and that's why that's at least for me, that's my motivation. And I also have to say that that driver has been changing in the past decade, but in a way that just made it much more urgent. Um, so when I started, it was more from the place of seeing the potential of it. It was obvious to me. I looked around and I saw there are so many causes that people would like to organize around. If they just could, they don't think about it because they don't have you know, the idea that it's possible. But if they just could organize easily 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people, 1,000,000 people, there's so many causes that will be executed on. And it was obvious to me that the world will be 1,000 times better. I think what changed over the course of the past decade was that, and that we didn't. I personally didn't see that 10 years ago, but now I think it's very very obvious. And that in the past, I don't know, 5 7 years, that the whole system that we are now tapped to, the regular state system, the regular corporate system, the regular economic system and global system we are tapped to, is completely, fault and collapsing and driving off the cliff. And I think now it's actually a matter of existential matter. I think that the only way that society can correct itself is if 1,000,000 people would be able to organize, to self-organize together for action. It can be both, a one-time action for a specific cause or an ongoing action like a nation. And I mean, I think it's now understood very well how the current system are captured. The current system are corrupted, even though they are trying to be somewhat decentralized. You could say democracy is decentralized, but actually people have captured the seats, and and the only way to uncapture that is if the next step society, the economic power, the center of gravity, or the mass, where the mass is in terms of economic power, um, would be held by large networks and not by centralized authorities of any kind, because large networks in their nature, they take into account for wider interest, for wider incentives. They are less capturable or corruptible. So now I really see that as a necessity. Like, it's not just any longer a bonus that we may increase the potential of humanity. I actually think that's the only thing that will, in a way, free us from the the train that is now running off the cliff at this moment. And I think every year is just accelerating. And of course, there is much more theory about this acceleration, this running off the cliff. I'm not going to talk about that more, because I think there are people who are teaching about that much better. I'm just learning from them. But people like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall and many others, I think, have beautiful writings and podcasts and everything and videos explaining the current problem. And I think by now there is quite a consensus that the only logical solution to that is a large scale coordination.
And actually, I want to add something to this, because in some way, like, I think it's also the institutional structure that we use is very delicate. Is very important, in the sense that the core problem is, like, how do you achieve collective action? And it's not that we haven't tried, right? It's like, we have companies, we have organizations, we have governments. Those are all created in order to actually achieve collective action. um, and the challenge, though, is that many times when you create those institutions, then the institution become this kind of alien being, um, which actually brings people to do things that they will never do otherwise, right? And it's very interesting, like, because I resonate a lot with what you say, that if we had people, like, most people are good people, and if those good people were to do collective action, good things will come out of it. But the good people that will do that are the same people that today are actually doing, like, harsh competition, exploitation, wars, and so forth, because of the institutions that have been created, right? And for me, like, when we're talking about coordinations and network sovereignties and so forth, there's also the question of, how do we ensure that, as we create a new structure, a new institution that enable people to engage into collective action, how do we ensure that this doesn't actually lead to the same outcome of distorting somehow the collective action problem into creating something that the institution is doing for its own benefit, as opposed to actually being instrumentalized by the collective action that the people want to do, right? And I think when we're thinking about states and governments, the origin is a great origin. It's like, we want to live in a society, we want to coordinate the society, and then we create those institutions that also then acquire a life on their own, and then can become very oppressive to the people that actually created it. So it's like, I think it's not enough to just talk about collective action, because I think we need to admit that we have achieved very large scale mechanism of collaboration, but somehow they are easily corruptible, and they are corrupted by the institution itself. And I think when we're talking about those new types of coordinations and network sovereignty, we want to avoid this. And so we need to design the institutional fabric in order to remain true to the original intention of why the institution was created to begin with.
Yeah, I agree. I would just say, I agree that the problem is not people. The problem, or to a large degree, the problem is not people. The problem, people mostly are good. I think the bad thing is not the people. Is the institute. Is the system. However, the way that the institute collapses is through people. So some people capture and abuse the structure, and a structure that we thought that is fairly decentralized, as people's capacity to impact other people has increased, some people learned how to use it in a very centralized manner. So even bodies or institutes that we thought before are pretty decentralized, i.e., democracies, I think are very, very capturable, much more capturable than we thought they are 30 years ago. So the question is really, so one way, I mean, it's not the only way you can ask it, but one way I think to phrase your question is, how do we build new infrastructures or new systems that are not that easily capturable, or that are not capturable, or they're even anti-fragile to capturability? That's even better, right? And so that's one way to look at it. I think there are other ways to look at it. For example, another way to look at it is from alignment of incentives. How do you create a system that automatically align incentives? For example, and I think all these things are somewhat similar to when we look at organisms, right? So, for example, in organism, you're not asking whether an organism has alignment of incentive. It's built into the system, right? The collective, in a way, pains or feels the pain of the cell, right? I'm the being, I'm the collective. Me, the consciousness, I'm the collective. And I feel the pain. I literally feel as my pain when my cells are burning, and the opposite, right? The cell is feels pain when I'm sick, right? And there is some sort of built-in alignment of interests. We'll probably will touch more about this, but I also think that, and I just mentioned it in the title and then let go. I also think that this fractal nature of things and the right balance of forces is very, very critical for this organismness to appear. And when I say balance of forces, what I mean is that if you look at this nesting, at this fractal of organs and cells, you can look at the at the balance between at every level. You can ask to what degree the child is autonomous versus is responsible to the higher level, right? There is always, like, if it's too autonomous, if it's totally not responsible for anything else, you just get tons of cells which is with zero responsibility, you get chaos. But if it's too much, if it's too less autonomous, it's too much responsible, or under the power of the parent, you get authoritarianism. So you need to find a way to create the right balance between, the independence and sovereignty of the cells and organs, and the responsibility and the alignment of interest between the organs and the cells in a certain level. So I think all of these are kind of like different ways to talk about
Yeah,
the
and
same
in
thing.
some way this is highly correlated with point 7 of a recipe, which is this type of alignment of interest is achieved by inter interweaving, right?
Right,
If I am interwoven with another actor, then I
right.
cannot but wish for this actor to do as well as possible, because then I'd also do as well as possible. And so in some ways, like, the traditional way of scaling up is centralizing things, because decentralization leads to potential conflict of interest or competition. And what we're trying to do with this coordination system is actually, how do you scale up while maintaining the alignment and while actually increasing cooperation as opposed to competition between the fractalized nodes. And my hypothesis will be that these mechanism of excessively or intentionally creating additional interdependencies is one of the solutions that will ensure that you can scale fractally while ensuring that every single fractal node in the network is acting in the interest of itself and therefore of the whole.
If I can add on that, I totally agree with that, and but also want to add that it's actually critical that you scale up in a fractal way, because you're talking about interdependence, and you sometimes you call it sharing blood. You remember in Zuzalu, and And this sharing, let me make an example. If you have no fractal, let's say you take 1 million people and they're all in a single vessel, and then you're sharing blood. Sharing blood means that some success or damage of the collective is corresponding with success or damage of the individual, right? And then you're saying, okay, so now I have the interest to make the collective success. But we all know that that doesn't work because of tragedy of the commons, because that individual says, okay, everyone else will take care for the success of the collective. And if just me, if just me is not going to do that, I will gain both my free energy that I just reserved and as well the success of everyone else. But the tragedy of the common is that everyone said that, and the whole interest game collapse. So, but that's not true when you have fractal. You have many levels, and then each level is actually quite intimate. So then actually you get you that actually fixes the tragedy of the commons. So the sharing blood or the interdependencies, and actually in reality I think it's much more complex than just a tree, a nested tree. It's actually more like a graph, because different organs can be sub organs to several components, and different cells can be sub system to different organs. So it's really like a whole mesh network, such that from at each level, the alignment of interest is actually quite intimate to some degree, in an economic sense.
And so, speaking about this, I think it would be interesting, maybe as well, because you're working on a project called Common, and this is you're basically referring to a lot of the, I think, concepts that are crucial for the applications that you guys are building there. Would you like to talk a bit more about Common and how you see scaling coordination fractally via technological infrastructure, I guess, or using the blockchain?
Okay, so firstly, I want to say we tend to think about that in terms, maybe, I mean, I'm a bit detouring, but just it's a common, and then I go back to what you were asking, but it's related. So we are talking about nesting or fractalizing, right? And usually when we think about that, we think about it in a physical sense. So for example, you have different states, and in different states you have different cities, in different cities you have different neighborhoods, in different neighborhoods you have different blocks, in different blocks you have different buildings, different buildings you have different apartments, all the way to the cell. So this is let's call it a physical fractal, and it can be all very distributed, but still it's a physical, like it's a less, and it's smaller and smaller. It's in the community in the community space, community dimension, in the people dimension. Another way, another chapter, another idea I want to bring in is that we're also talking about the fractal in the content dimension, in the content scale. If you want to collaborate across a large number of people, it means that the collaboration, the action, the collective action that you're generating is very complex. So that collective action can be broken down to sub actions, which can be broken down to sub actions, and so on and so forth. And that's not exactly the same. They are related, but they're not exactly the same. You can do a fractal in people scape and space, and you can do a fractal in content space, and that's not quite the same. And I think that that's actually an important note. I think that the right way to scale up a large scale collaboration is by doing a fractal on the content dimension. It, of course, naturally will organize to some sort of fractal at the people direct dimension, but not exactly quite the same. So that's maybe one comment. Going back to like asking, okay, so how that relates to a technology, how that relates to an app, to a platform, to user interface. So, I mean, we all have a notion of a group, group space, group workspace. So the most simple example would be a WhatsApp group or a Telegram group, right? So if you want to have now a certain scope of action, you would open a Telegram group. If you have a slightly more complex scope of action, you might open a Discord channel, because then you can embody 30 groups, 30 channels in there. And now, by the way, Telegram has a new feature of, it's called topics, so you can embody inside the Telegram group 30 topics, such topics. So in a sense, I think it's not very different from that. So we need to start from something like that. We need to start from the notion of, I like to call it a space, but you can call it different words. I mean, you can call it a group. I don't like the notion of group. That's connected to the comment I said before. I don't like the notion of group, because when you say group, you are hinting that the encapsulated space is differentiated by the people in it. And actually, I want to say that the encapsulated space is differentiated by the content scope in it. So that's why I like less the wording of a group for that. But from a technological application purpose, it's the same. So imagine that you have a space, again, like a Telegram channel, a group. You have a space for specific content, right? Or specific scope, specific missions, specific specific scope. I think that's the most general terminology. And now, in the sense of that fractal, imagine that you can now have daughters or children to that group or to that channel or to that space. So now you have subspaces, which are then encapsulating a smaller and narrower part of the scope. You have yet subspaces and subspaces all the way until you have the most tiniest scope. And so firstly, with that, you can span a very large scale collaboration. Maybe I should say, okay, what do you have in each node on that graph? What do you have in each node on the graph? You have a scope of action. That scope of action can contain the regular chat that you're used to, just a chat room, that's basically. But it can also have its own governance system, membership system, funding, incoming funds, outgoing funds, anything. So anything, it's basically every node on that graph. Every node on the graph is what you would call a DAO, basically, or a sub DAO. Now, when you have this fractal of nodes, you can both go. I think usually we are tending to think how powerful it is that we can go upward. We can go to a broad scopes, because we can build up, certain small scopes into a bigger scope, certain bigger scope into yet bigger scope, and so on and so forth. I think what is more surprising is actually that we can break down further downward. I think that's actually more surprising, although it's actually more trivial. What do I mean by that? It means that the thing that you're usually thinking about them as a single group, the usual scope that you think would be in a single group, you can actually break down into 10 subspaces. And even then, you can find out they can break them down yet to more subspaces, all the way until eventually the cell, the very cell of a scope, that scope is very, very focused. You're just having a single conversation in that cell. Like if you just think about any Telegram chat that you've seen, recently, you remember that there's dozens of conversations are trying to merge in that room, and because of that, they're all breaking each other, and none of them is actually. Have you ever seen a single conversation going on for a month in a Telegram chat? I've never seen such thing, because the conversations are stepping on each other. And if you actually want to have a space which a specific scope, which has longevity, that it can go on, and people can come in and go out, and it's open, and 100 different people who don't know each other can all contribute to the same scope. If you want that, you need the scopes to be the most well-defined they can be. A single conversation until it's saturated. So I just, in that comment, I think it's small but important comment. I just was trying to say that just as this fractal structure of cells, of spaces that maybe would look like Telegram channels or Telegram groups, just as they are powerful that you can scale them up, they're actually powerful that you can break them down into a very granular cells of action. So eventually, if you're asking how that looks like, it really looks, when you're standing on a single node, what you see is just that activity of that node. You see a chat. That chat is the chat of that node. You can see the tasks of that node. You can see all of the daughters of that node. You can see which daughters, which subscopes are connected to it. You can see the parents of that, which parents this node is part of. And you can see also of course the dynamics around that. You can see incoming transaction, outgoing transaction, evaluations, and so on and so forth, contributions made, and so on and so forth. I totally get it that it's abstract, in that way. So uh, I hope that it conveys something. But I'm talking about a very specific user interface. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe an easier way to explain that would be to just say kind of like a wiki, but it's also it is not just one direction, as in you're not just creating fractalization in one direction, but things are also being related uh, almost like horizontally as well. So that there is this kind of like, thus you create this kind of hierarchical diagram of related topics and concepts, or yeah, things that are related to one another. Because, and which is similar to on a Wikipedia, you can, there are links to horizontal things on one single Wikipedia page. You don't necessarily go just in one direction, deeper and deeper into a rabbit hole down, but you explore the expanse
yeah,
around it.
yeah, totally. And the other difference is that it's actually it's a living
So it's
cell or
changing.
organ. So it's not just a static page you're coming and reading, but you can have a conversation in there. People can, different people that don't know each other can find themselves in that node and have conversations. They can open new conversation, and it's very dynamic. I mean, you could say that also Wikipedia is dynamic, but it's slowly moving. This is very fastly moving. You're coming into a node, you're just proposing a new question, new sub question, and like that, there is a new node with a new conversation, a new outcome, maybe a new purpose, maybe new definition of done if it's a project, a new subtask, and so forth. It's a very dynamic system. It's a living system. So it's like a collaborative. No, not collaborative about just writing. Yeah, it's like real time. It's a real time Wikipedia. Something like Wikipedia time Telegram channels times Trello, something like that. Times governance of each node. Anyway, I think kind of like that's kind of like the max I can try to explain the UI without showing a UI, but that's
Yeah. So it's a knowledge management system to be able to create a kind of collective intelligence to where people can have context about certain things and certain specific things if action needs to be done or understood.
yeah, yeah. Plus the live conversation around all that context and
Mm-hmm.
content and actions.
Hi, everyone. If you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the episode or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons like Arthur, Sinclair, and Pedro, which really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did and access to bonus content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts on roughly 20 minutes. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out.
Yeah, I think maybe we can also discuss a little bit, like, to me, like, it feels like we discussed the tools, but I feel like, Matan, I would love if we can hear more of your protocol thinking about, yeah, these, like, what are the various ways in which you think that this fractalization, the scaling up the fractals, can be done, and like, what are the various ways in which this interweaving can be enabled via blockchain or without via blockchain. I don't know, like, because right now we spoke mostly about the tool for, I guess, I mean, I guess that's deliberation, but I think we need to sort this out, but we also need to sort out many other technicalities. And yeah,
Right.
I'm curious if you have, like, some ideas or some suggestions of what are the various ways in which interweaving can be achieved given specific communities, of course.
So one, I mean, maybe a, a pre. pretext to this, to answering that. So I tried, in the previous, let's say, exercise, I tried to exemplify how a large scale coordination, or a complex coordination would be broken down, would have structure, right? And a fractal structure. That's what I was trying to give example for. So the outcome was sort of the graph, and as you pointed out, it's not just a nested graph. It's really like what I call DAG, or descent. Not I call, what people call directed acyclic graph. So you can have different trajectories to the same point. So and then the next step is to understand, okay, but what is the point on that graph? And I try to kind of like explain what is the point on that graph. And I said the point is like a space with a certain scope, with with a place for conversation, deliberation, and maybe also a place for tasks, missions, funding, and everything you need to have, like for any part of the collaboration, right? So I describe what the point is on the graph. And then the next question is, okay, if we understand what the point, then what is a link between 2 points, right? What can link be? And that's related to interweaving. Now, the link can be. I think I understand what you were asking, Prim. So you were more interested about the interdependence, the sharing blood piece of that, the protocol part of that. So I'll come to that in a minute. But just to say that the link is a wider concept in that. That's part of what a link is. And some parts of the link are very technical, let's say, less protocol, but they're also protocol in a sense. Let me give you examples so that it doesn't stay too abstract. For example, let's say that you have a subscope of a bigger scope, right? The notion of membership is actually quite tricky. For example, you could say that the link, the relationship between this node and that node, this node decide that if someone is a member of some sort of that node, I want him to be automatically a member of that node, of this node. So membership inheritance is actually a part of what we define as link. The definitions of membership inheritance. If someone is a leader in that node, we want him to automatically be a leader in that node. Someone has some reputation X in there, we want to account for reputation YX in there, and so on and so forth. So everything around membership and properties of membership, such as reputation and the inheritance between nodes, this is part of the notion of a link. Um, for example, another part of the link is reputation of one node inside the other. So if one node has governance rights, the collective around that node has a governance rights in the other node. That's also something which is part of that link. Then you can go to interweaving to I mean, that's also part of interweaving, but then you could go to interdependence, for example. And I think the easiest, I mean, the first thing that comes to our mind is economical interdependence. I mean, the problem with that is I think it's we are too much driven into economical interdependence, and I think we're not thinking enough about non-economical interdependence. But nevertheless, it's the easiest to think about. So let's stay with that for a moment. So we think about economic interdependence. So, for example, and then there is a lot of ways to manifest that, but the simplest way, and again, I'm trying to say the simplest at every chapter. So the simplest economic interdependence between nodes, let's think about them as parent as child, is think that you have the token of the parent, you have the token of the child, right? You have the economy of the token of the parent, you have the economy of the token of the child, and now imagine that they token swap in some sense. And there are different ways to do token swaps or something like a token swap. You can also say that the only way to mint a token of the child is by staking a token of the parent. That's another way. There's some different ways, but they're all different manifestation of some sort of token swap, basically. So if you token swap between parent and child, of course, a success of the economy of the token of the child token derives the success of the parent, and vice versa, and also failure too. So I understand that that's not most general and maybe not the best way to think about interdependence between nodes, but it's definitely the easiest way to think about it. So I think that's
Yeah,
that's
exactly. I
the,
think
maybe
it's the
the start.
baseline, especially when you're thinking in a DAO model. That's
Right.
that's the low hanging fruit, I would say. And then you can choose which are the tokens that are being interchanged. Is it like economic tokens? Is it governance tokens? Is it whatever? Um, is it a particular type of token which actually lead to like idiosyncratically creating interdependency on some aspect, but not also. So there's like, I think the token is I will say it's almost the means by which most likely things can be done, because the token is just a
Right.
representation of something. Um,
Right.
but yeah, I think there is a lot of thinking to be done in terms of what are the consequences of sharing a particular resource rather than another, and what is the optimal combination of interdependencies that can be designed.
Yeah, I think we are very far from understanding optimal or anything like optimal. I think we can just start playing with building blocks, and seeing what's happening. But if we want to make all this very tangible, not stay abstract, let's take a very very particular example. Let's say that you now have a DAO, and or a collective, whatever, a collective. That collective is competing against whatever other collectives maybe, and in a hackathon, okay, in a big hackathon, and it needs to achieve certain goals, certain to build something, okay. And if it wins, if it's successful in building that something quickly, then it gets $1 million, okay. So now imagine that that's something that you're building has three components, right? And then so you're building the A component, the B component, the C component, and maybe there's a D group that connect all those components together. And now imagine that each such component is it's a sub concept, is a sub scope, it's a subgroup, if you wish, sub DAO, whatever you call that, okay. But then I don't like it to call it a subgroup, because then people can play also here and there and be in several groups. So it's not really a subgroup, it's more like a sub scope. So there is the scope of building A, scope of building B, scope of building C, and the scope of connecting A, B, and C, which is D. And then imagine that you have a way to sort of define eventually, and let's say that eventually, if they win, right, they get the $1 million. But there is also this understanding how that $1 million will be distributed towards the contributors of A, B, C, and D, right? And this is something like holding a token of the parent, right? The notion of how much value you've accrued, how much value you've contributed, and how much value you will see back upon a success. You can manifest that with holding of the token of the parent. So now, if I'm working on a component C, right? I mean, I can be very successful, but then if component B is not achieved, I will see nothing, right? At the end of the day, I will see nothing. So I have the interest to help. So although I'm kind of like competing with component B to get a larger share of the win, I'm also and to try to be big and get a larger share of the win. I also have a very strong incentive to make B and A and D successful. Otherwise, I will get nothing, right? So that's a very, although maybe you'd say it's a stupid example, but it's a very particular example where we see kind of interweaving economic interdependence and alignment of interests happening. And if you break it down to manifestation, it will go down into some sort of token swap or token hold or mutual token holding and so on and so forth. Something of that sort, I think, will be appearing more and more, but probably it will be different manifestation, different combination, different valuation mechanisms, different stakes, so on and so forth. And I don't think there is we're not even close to. I don't think it's even in the stage right now to think about optimization. It's the stage we are at is to think about building blocks in particular use cases,
Yeah.
and trying to devise
I
them.
think a lot of the things that that you said and that you've kind of explained, I've seen similar things in um, other types of crypto applications. I think there is this trend more and more towards fractalization. People like to use the term sub DAOs as a way to explain a, a sub team inside of a DAO. Basically, it sounds like to me. Um, but yeah, I think it's this need to keep things to allow a human to be a human, because humans can only interact within a particular sized scope, while also trying to control for what is being reproduced at scale. So understanding how at the kind of the level of the human is able to interact with other humans, because that's the only way we can really we interact with other humans. That's what comes naturally to us, I guess. But how that can be translated into larger collective action using, this communications network that we now have over the internet, and using blockchains to facilitate those types of interactions. Yeah, I don't know if Primavera, do you have any other questions you want to dig into with Matan? We've talked a lot about coordination.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, no, I think we covered a lot of ground.
I think what I like about when you were explaining coordination, which is in line with some of my writings in my book, which is now out, is that a lot of that, like, coordination for me is not just people working together. It's also like acknowledging, I think, power relationships and the fact that there is authoritarianism in the world, and we don't coordinate just to coordinate, but we coordinate to achieve goals, and acknowledging kind of like the power imbalances that exist in the world already is what makes coordination worthwhile or useful, necessary, in fact, for like climate change and all these other large problems that we have hurtling towards us.
I mean, I think it's also a way of reconfiguring power, right? Because right now we have a lot of power accumulated into a few actors. And if we find ways to engage into proper collective action, then we can reconfigure power dynamics so that what the majority of the people want actually gets done.
Right. I mean, I think it's both that, and also utilizing much better the resources that we have in terms of humans and good intention that right now just cannot coordinate to produce better results. But yeah, it's both. These are both different sides of the same token. I think I'm trying to think, like, what's the I don't know if I would call it a lesson, but I feel, and that's very much related to what I've been doing in the past year or so, maybe a bit less, mostly with the work on common that is pretty much now getting out. I mean, as a product, is that, I mean, we were talking about. I mean, Prim, you definitely you'd agree with that. I mean, we were talking about these fractals and nested and sub DAOs. We were talking about this, like, I don't know, like 8 years ago, right? And we've heard so many people talking about them, but it always stays abstract. Always stay like, you can say a fractal 1,000 times, it doesn't make it more concrete. I mean, you can say, okay, it's kind of like Wikipedia, it's kind of like Reddit, it's kind of like other things. If you know workflow, for those who know what's workflow, it's like workflow. It's like Rome research. If you know Rome research, it's like a nested bullets. Just now you ask, okay, but what is a bullet in that sense? What I came to appreciate when starting to work on common was how do we bring that? I mean, it's enough talking about that, but how do we bring it into the ground? Like, how do we actually make it a UI, something that actually can people organize with, people can organize with into action, and it's really, I mean, eventually, and I don't know yet, right? The product will be out soon, and we'll see if people can use it to achieve large scale goals or not. Maybe, and I don't know. We'll see the future, but only when actually asking, looking at the screens and saying, okay, this, we need a platform to do that, and then suddenly there's so many questions come up, when you actually try to make it from an abstract idea into an actual user interface that interact with you. Yeah, I now I appreciate that. I appreciate that, trying to build something to actually make it work. Where even if it wouldn't work, like really fighting that battle to bring these abstract ideas that we're talking about so many times into an actual interface that you click and it changes and you click and you interact with people and seeing what works. And I think that's something that, yeah, we have to go through. And I really believe in that. Like, I really, I don't know, I can't wait to play with that. That's what I'm saying. So, for example, the first thing we're going to do, and literally that we're starting, next week, just happens. The first thing that I'm interested to do is to start work as a common to continue developing common, like to practice and to eat our own dog food. Like just can't wait to play with the product and see what doesn't work, what works, what missing. I just feel that this kind of like complex product making you cannot make without playing with it. You cannot make, there's so much you can achieve. And likewise, I'm saying that also in regard to your question about the protocols. Like, I just feel that there's just so much you can go talking about in theory before actually taking a real world example and breaking it down and building a bad protocol and changing it to a better protocol and so on and so forth. So I'm just so my bottom line is that I just can't wait to take a real world community, a real world scope, a real world collaboration, and so on, and start playing with such products, these or other products, and even if it's like manually devised protocols, rewarding protocols, anything, like just really playing with that on the ground. That's what I'm really passionate about right now.
Cool. Yeah, I wish you the best of luck with Common. Maybe the last thing for people, if you want to leave places where people can find you, your work, and keep up with Common as well.
Sure. I mean, the easiest place is just to get to the homepage, which is still the old homepage, but nevertheless, it's common.io. There is a link there to the app, but yeah, you need a link to a specific common to. Yeah, actually, I'm going to write a blog post about it, so you can also just follow me on Twitter or anything, or you can also just mail me if you wish, matan@daostack.io or matan@common.io.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, it was a pleasure to have you in Zuzalu to help us with the workshopping for coordinations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matan.